Welcome to another episode of the DDGeopolitics podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I'm very excited to once again welcome Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, professor at Tehran University and renowned political analyst. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm very good. And thank you for inviting me.
You are so welcome. And thank you for making the time again. Firstly, we obviously want to give our sincere condolences to you and to the people of the Islamic Republic in the wake of the tragedy. I believe you've met both the president and the foreign minister prior to this. Can you talk about these two from maybe a personal perspective? And I'm asking because in the West, they're obviously dehumanized and kind of then rewritten as these like supervillains. We know really nothing about them. And at the time of his passing, the foreign minister was really like becoming very like well-known in the international arena. So what were they like on a more like personal level?
Both of them were quite humble, very friendly. The president in particular, since I knew him a bit better, I was on a number of his international trips. He was very hardworking. During the international trips, he would basically be working from very early in the morning till very late at night. And I really couldn't keep up. Fortunately, I was not in any of the negotiations or that sort of thing. But he had many activities at universities and public gatherings, and I was basically invited by his office on some of these trips for the media. So I'm not a part of the president's office, or I don't work for the government. I'm just a university professor. But my experiences on those trips were that he would sleep very little, and that he got everything done. So they would have a full schedule, and he would make sure that everything was properly done. But he was very polite, as I said, very humble, and very, very smart person. I knew him probably a bit better than the foreign minister, not through a great deal of personal contact, but through the people who were around him. So I think it was a very great loss. During his presidency, he would go to the provinces, each province at least once a year, and that's 30 trips. And then you have the international trips, and you also have occasions where he'd have to go twice to different provinces. So he was constantly on the move. Every time he would visit a province, he would make sure to go to some of the most deprived areas in the provinces to see what sort of problems exist, and those who've been more deprived in the past, that they get their fair share. At least the situation gets pushed in the direction where they get a better share. So he was very strong on social justice, the president, very keen on expanding ties with Asian countries, African countries, and Latin America, meaning the global South, and improving ties with neighbors. And so he has achieved a lot. Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia and with Egypt normalized. And Iran has built very close economic relations with most of its neighbors under his presidency. So I think that probably his biggest achievement was foreign policy. It is so much so that even his political opponents rarely touch upon what he has accomplished in his foreign policy.
So there was a very large number of Iranians who went to pay their respects at the funerals. It really seems to contradict the narrative that the Iranian population is politically divided. And I think that they said it was one of the largest, if not the largest, funeral processions in Iran. Can you share your thought on this sort of kind of dichotomy between what is being painted and what is real?
Well, literally an hour or so, or maybe a couple of hours after it was declared that he had passed away in the morning, the day after, I was on the BBC television. And before me, they brought in two supposed, I don't know, Iranian Canadians or Iranian Americans who were saying, two ladies who were saying how people in Iran are celebrating and people are expressing joy. And after, I don't know, 10, 12, 13 minutes of this sort of nonsense, the host finally got to me and I said, well, I have not seen any sign of anyone celebrating. And yesterday when the helicopter went missing, I was at work and people were worried, colleagues, co-workers, students, ordinary people. But I said that when we have the funerals and you have millions of people come to the streets, how are you going to deal with these contradictions? Because the BBC and other Western media, they're promoting the notion that people hated him and despised him, but when the millions come to the streets, then how are they going to deal with that? So that ended, and then 3 days later, I think, I was invited again on the BBC. I think the same shows, roughly the same hour, maybe the same host. And I raised this issue. I said, look at the funerals. And because the host said there are thousands of people. And I said, there are millions in Tehran. And he said, and I said, and I'll look at what happened in Tabriz, the city where the helicopter was on its way to when it crashed. There was a huge funeral there, and then in the city of Qom and in Mash. And I said the next day will be in Mashhad. And then the host sort of, he didn't know what to say. But then I said that, you've been saying, and other Western media have been saying that people are celebrating. Are there any signs of people celebrating? And he said, well, some people may be celebrating. So they began 3 days earlier with people celebrating. And then he said, well, some people in any country may celebrate. Sure. If you have 85 to 90 million people, I'm sure you're going to have some people who are going to be, if there's a nuclear war that destroys the earth, maybe some people will be celebrating. Who knows? I mean, but that doesn't reflect public opinion just because a few insane people celebrate something strange, or just because he says some people may be celebrating. That's not reflective of Iranian public opinion. And I think what it does reflect, though, is it shows how ignorant the West is about Iran. And that ignorance comes from hiring people, many of them so-called Iranians, Iran experts, who say what they want to hear, and they know that what they have to say, otherwise they won't get hired or they won't be able to get funding. So these people say what needs to be said. They hear what they want to hear, and then they implement policies that always fail, and they always wonder why their policies fail. And since there's no accountability in the West, because no one can say that, well, actually, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a high degree of public legitimacy, the leadership, the country, the leaders are very competent, the president is viewed, let's say, favorably. You can't say that in the West. So since there's no accountability, they will, after the next issue arises, you will have the same people saying the same nonsense, and then again you're going to have policies implemented that make no sense and that are destined to fail, and it just goes on and on because, like, as I said, there's no accountability in the West. Mm-hmm. So then I'm sure that when it comes to Russia, or when it comes to Palestine, and when it comes to much of the global South, it's more or less the same story. And I think that's one reason why the Western Empire is so rapidly on the decline. Their arrogance doesn't allow them to see reality.
In Iran recently, an Iranian official, and I can't remember which one. I'm sorry, but they stated that despite these significant losses, the Iranian government would continue when people would not even notice any changes. Have you observed anything that contradicts this statement, and what kind of safeguards are put in place that makes the Iranian government just so unshakable and able to just continue on? I just know that in the West, even though Joe Biden doesn't really do anything, had he died today, I'm sure that there would be large changes noticed, and things would kind of come to sort of not like a slowdown or at least a halt. But in Iran, it's like they just didn't skip a beat.
No, there was only one day, which was there were 5 days were declared days of mourning, but all government buildings and offices and private companies and public companies continued to work. It was only one day when people were off, and that was the day when we had the funeral in Tehran. It was a Wednesday. So the government continued to work even on the day when his demise was announced. And according to the Constitution, his first vice president, assumes the responsibilities of the president until elections take place. And within a few days, the date for a new election was declared, and we're going to have elections in a short period of time. So the government is functioning as normal, and when the new president comes, of course, he'll bring his own cabinet. There may be overlap. There may be some who remain in government, and some others may change depending on who's the president. If it's so, we will have obviously a change in direction of sorts, because each president has his own style, his own people, his own vision. But the transition is smooth. That is without a doubt.
So you mentioned obviously.
Just 1 second. Just 1 second.
You're fine. You're fine.
Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. Okay. So you did mention the upcoming presidential elections. Former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he announced that he will be running. That is probably that's sort of a very household name in the West. I think just because of how much we were in touch with the Middle East while he was president. It's likely, though, that sorry to age you and I both, but it's likely that many of our listeners may not be familiar with him at all. I forget that we might have like 24-year-olds here. But could you provide a short overview of his presidency, what that was like for Iran, foreign and domestically, and what he's been doing in the last decade, and kind of like public sentiment surrounding his reemergence?
Well, there are quite a few people who applied to stand for presidency, and a number of them are heavyweights. The current Speaker of Parliament, the former Speaker of Parliament, the Mayor of Tehran, the former head of the Supreme National Security Council. So there are quite a few heavyweights. Ahmadinejad, though I doubt he will, also the former first vice president for Mr. Rouhani, the former president, his first vice president. Ahmadinejad signed up. I doubt he will be approved. He was a very controversial figure during his presidency. He was very divisive, both at home and also he caused me a lot of difficulty because he constantly spoke about the Holocaust, and which I think people here found it to be an unnecessary debate. You can expose the Zionist regime and its illegitimacy and its brutality without having to raise an issue that has to do with Europeans. It has nothing to do with the region. It has nothing to do with Palestine, and it only provides an excuse for Iran's enemies to create a link that's non-existent. So I would often have to go to the media and explain that the position of the Islamic Republic of Iran. As a normal citizen, I've never had, except for on two brief occasions, when I was with the nuclear negotiators in 2015 in Vienna, and a couple of years ago again in Vienna, 3 years ago again in Vienna. I was with Dr. Zarif and Dr. Bagheri in Vienna for a few months combined, where I was a media advisor for the negotiators, international media advisor. But besides that, I've always spoken as a citizen. I do not have any public position. I never had. But I would be invited on media outlets a lot to discuss what he had said, and I always thought it was a meaningless argument, especially since he's not a historian. And I understand many people do have many questions about many issues, and many people do not trust Western history books on any particular topic. But I always found that to be unnecessary for an Iranian president to pursue so much. But also, he was divisive on other issues. He had positive qualities, but he had a number of people around him who were questionable and who got into legal problems. So I don't think he's going to be approved. But even if he was, I don't think he would be someone who he has too many. He has supporters who love him, but those who dislike him are many and from different political persuasions in the country. But I think that there will be a number of candidates that are that will be approved, who will be diverse in views. I think the debates, which we'll have in a couple of weeks, will be pretty hard hitting. I hope they're not too aggressive. One of the very positive characteristics of Dr. Raisi, President Raisi, was that he was very polite. He would not respond to insults. He would not respond in kind, and he would not even respond because he did not want hatred and hostility to build. So he was a very he made Iranian politics a lot more let's say acceptable within the morally speaking. In other words, it was the aggressiveness and the hatred and the hostility that you often see in politics across the world. He would not play that game with his political opponents. He was quite successful in that regard, and it was very it was something very honorable and something that I think the future president and those who are going to be in the debates, I hope they look at as something that they should pursue as well. But we'll see. Right now, it's too early to say what will happen, who the candidates will be, what sort of changes we'll have in foreign policy or economic policy. That'll be clear pretty soon.
So recently, the UN Nuclear Watchdog's Board of Governors passed a resolution which criticized Iran's lack of cooperation with their demands. Iran warned that it would have a destructive effect on diplomatic efforts and threatened a serious and effective response. They're alleging that Iran is enriching uranium, reaching 60%, which is just below weapons grade. How do you respond to the recent decision and Iran calling it hasty and unwise? And also, when they mention a serious and effective response, what could that be?
we all know that in 2015, the Iranians and the P5+1, they signed a nuclear deal. And from the very beginning, the Americans began violating the deal. And ultimately, under Trump, they just tore up the deal. So in accordance with the provisions of that deal, Iran decreased its commitments to the deal, and ultimately it halted its commitments. So the United States and the Europeans are in no position to complain about Iran not abiding by its commitments, because they didn't abide by their commitments. They chose to wreck the deal, the Americans, and the Europeans chose not to resist. And so Iran had no option. In fact, Iran waited a full year. They continued to fully implement their side of the bargain for a full year, even though the Americans had imposed maximum pressure sanctions and the Europeans obeyed the Americans under Trump. And then after a year, Iran, in 5 stages, every 2 months, they would decrease their commitments until we reach where we are today. So they gradually decrease their commitments. Right now, Iran is only going to abide by what the NPT and its minimal requirements in accordance with international law demand. That's all Iran will do. Iran is not going to go any further. And if the Americans and the Europeans want Iran to increase cooperation, they know what they have to do. They have to revive a nuclear deal, but in a way in which they can no longer betray the Iranians as they did in the past. There have to be mechanisms in place where they can no longer violate the deal. Remember, the problem with the West, I think Clinton once said this when he was the president. He said something like, and if someone could find this, I'd be very grateful, because I haven't been able to find it myself. But apparently Clinton once says that the United States abides by all of its commitments unless it decides it no longer needs to do so. And I think the audience laughed. But that's basically what the Americans are like. And we saw it's not just Iran with the JCPOA, but it's also the Minsk Accords, and how later on we saw how Merkel said we never were serious about the accords, or how Hollande said the same thing. And so when the West signs a deal, you can't trust them. So this time around, after they violated and tore up the nuclear deal, the Iranians, if there's going to be a revival of any deal, the conditions will be different. The Americans will not be allowed to have any room for maneuver so that they could cheat Iran again. So it's really up to the West to normalize relations and to have to solve the differences over the nuclear program, the peaceful nuclear program. But also the West has to recognize the world has changed. Iran today is much more powerful. The West is in a much more difficult situation. The West is now in conflict with Russia. Its conflict with China is on the rise. In our region, the West is on the losing side of the conflict. The Israeli regime has lost the war. It has lost in the eyes of global public opinion. It is a diminished regime, a hated regime, seen as illegitimate. So the things are different today. Iran is much stronger. It has many allies, both in the region, in the axis of resistance, and across the world. So the United States and Europeans, if they want to solve their problems with Iran, they have to recognize these issues.
So you did mention something about Iran's comments on the Minsk Accords, which kind of shift to the former Soviet bloc, interestingly enough, to Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Armenians are, what I've been observing is them getting kind of nervous, a little bit on edge with their current situation, not the government, obviously, but the actual population. But what are your thoughts on this situation? How do we make sure that Armenia keeps its sovereignty and its integrity, while Pashinyan is sort of giving up villages to Azerbaijan at the same time?
Well, first, when it comes to the Minsk Accords, I gave that as an example where, like the nuclear deal, the West was never serious about implementing its side of the bargain. And so in future, if there's going to be a deal, there has to be mechanisms in place where they can no longer cheat, where they cannot just suddenly, because the expectations in the West is that the other side must always abide by its commitments, but they don't have to abide by their commitments in the West. They have special privileges. They are exceptional. And we see that. And so the reason why I gave those examples is to point out where things stand with the Iranians in the future. In future, if Iran wants to have a deal with the West, it's going to be a deal where they can't cheat anymore. It's not going to be like in 2015. There have to be mechanisms in place to tie the hands of the Americans so that if they pull out of the deal, it hurts them. And that's actually good for a deal, because when all sides feel that pulling out of the deal comes at a price, then the incentive to remain in the deal increases. With regards to the Caucasus and the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Republic of Armenia, these two countries, from the Iranian perspective, have to recognize international borders. And when Armenia occupied territory of Azerbaijan, that was not acceptable to Iran. Iran always said that. Iran had very good relations with Armenia. It had very good relations with Azerbaijan. But illegal occupation was unacceptable. And when Azerbaijan takes Armenian territory, that is unacceptable as well. And Iran has warned Azerbaijan when there was when there were serious concerns that they may try to invade Armenia and take especially the southern part of Armenia. The Iranians warned the government in Baku that that would not be tolerated. And Baku understood exactly what Iran meant. So the smart thing for Azerbaijan and Armenia to do is to respect the borders, to end the conflict, to build trust, and to build an economic relationship in order to enhance the economies and to improve the lives of the people of that region. Georgia, of course, is another important country for Iran. Iran does not want to see Armenia, Georgia, or Azerbaijan to move in the wrong direction and tilt towards the NATO camp. That would be destructive for them, and it would be detrimental to the interests of the region. NATO has nothing to do with our neighborhood. It is not their neighborhood, and they have to stay out of our neighborhood. The countries in this region, countries like Iran, Russia, and these countries have to work together so that the rights of Armenians are preserved, and Iran will make sure that Armenia remains intact. And the rights of Azerbaijan, of course, have to be preserved as well. So I think it's a mistake for any country in the region to look to Europe or the United States for their solutions. History has shown that it only causes misery, and we've seen that across the world. The West has no interest in improving the lives of people outside of the West. They only have their only objective will be to manipulate and to create division and to create hostility so that they could impose hegemony, especially now that the West is in such rapid decline. Their policies are even more dangerous than before. They're more reckless and dangerous and destructive than ever before, as we're seeing in Palestine.
Speaking of which, you brought up Georgia, which is awesome because nobody ever does. But I also want to bring up Serbia, Iran's emerging relationship with Serbia. What has been their relationship historically? What is Iran's interest in Serbia now? I do know that they have a deal for drones. I'm pretty sure that Serbia has already purchased some. And also with the current kind of shaky ground that the Balkans are on, especially between Bosnia Herzegovina and Serbia.
Well, Iran has good ties, very good ties with Serbia, but Iran also recognizes what happened to the Bosnians, and the Iranians were the only people to support the Bosnians when they were being brutalized, unfortunately, by Serbia, local Serbs. And but Iran makes a distinction between the country of Serbia today and what was happening in Bosnia at the time. And Iran never accepted what NATO did to Belgrade and the bombings that we saw in the past. So the relationship between Iran and Serbia today is very good. And Iran wants to make sure that Serbs and Bosnians today live side by side with in harmony, and so that no foreign players can use their land and their territory or any potential divisions to bring about misery and destruction again. That's the biggest concern. Just like in the Caucasus, that is the biggest concern. Western powers do not want peace, and therefore it is very important for Iran that Serbia remains strong and stable, and that Bosnia and Serbia also have good relations.
I'm going to switch over to the situation in occupied Palestine. Ansar Allah recently unveiled a new solid fuel missile. It was dedicated to the people of Palestine, shared the same name, and it was complete with the Palestinian flag and a kufiya. They claimed it could hit speeds of Mach 15. They fired it, and then it was intercepted. It was intercepted by the Arrow system. That's right. Will we see more of this missile, or was this kind of just a one-off that they used? And also, they're using a solid fuel state missile, and does that indicate that their missile launch sites have been damaged?
Well, I don't think it was a hypersonic missile. If it was, then it would there wouldn't be no possibility to stop it. They are developing new weapons. They have been developing weapon systems for the last decade, for over a decade, ever since the war with Saudi Arabia. And their drone and missile program is very well developed. It cannot be damaged, the program, or dented by the Americans, because it's all deep underground. That is something that we also see in Gaza. That is what we see in Lebanon and in Syria and elsewhere. The key facilities are deep underground to protect them from bombing. The Saudis, they were using the Air Force to carry out a genocidal war. So Yemen began developing these underground capabilities. This, for the same reason, Hamas and its allies did the same in Gaza. And of course, Hezbollah has been doing this extensively for a very, very long time. And that's one reason why you can be sure that the Israeli regime is lying when it says that it was targeting Hamas positions when it bombed the school. Because Hamas does not stay in any of these buildings. It does not stay in refugee camps. Hamas is in its bases that are deep underground, tens of meters underground. They are inaccessible to the Israeli regime. They have hospitals underground. They have command centers underground. They have many hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and also all the facilities that they need. underground. So the Israelis, when they bomb, they're just out there to kill people, and they use these. They make up these stories so that the Western media would have something to say in order to justify the genocide, which they do. We've seen how the Western media always tries to do its best to justify this Holocaust that's taking place in Gaza. But in the case of Yemen, just as the Saudis were never able to hit their underground facilities, factories, and bases, the Americans are unable to do so as well. And as we move forward, I think that new capabilities will emerge, both in Yemen, in Lebanon, but also in Gaza and in Iraq and Syria. I don't know if you know this, but from the very beginning, I was telling friends online and in discussions that Gaza will not fall in October. It's not from my own personal knowledge. It's from speaking to people in Iran who know what capabilities exist, and they were saying from the very beginning that Gaza will not fall. The defense capabilities are extraordinarily sophisticated. And if you recall, at the beginning, the Israelis were saying we're going to flood the tunnels and we're going to gas the tunnels, and a lot of my Palestinian friends were very worried. And I was telling them that no, the Israelis can't do this. Again, not because I have personal information, but because people who I trust, they were saying that it's not possible for the regime, for this Israeli regime, to take over Gaza because of these very sophisticated underground capabilities. So Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon, all of these three fronts are very well their assets are very well protected, and a lot of their capabilities are still hidden from the enemy.
About a week ago, Ansar Allah claimed that they had successfully hit the USS Eisenhower, that's aircraft carrier 69. Incidentally, that's what I deployed on that ship in 2016. It's kind of funny to me. I deployed on that ship to that theater, actually. Following this news, the USS Eisenhower left the theater in the area around Bab el-Mandeb, and there have been no updates since then. I find it highly unlikely that Ansar Allah would be able to inflict serious damage, but it's very suspicious that we haven't heard any updates at all about the ship. Could you share your thoughts, or maybe what's happened, what they're talking about inside of Iran?
Yes, my understanding is that they did hit the ship, and the intention is not necessarily to sink the ship. Just as you've noticed that many of these ships that were heading towards Israeli ports that were hit, they were not hit to sink them. They were hit to damage them and force them to turn away. So the objective of Ansar Allah is to implement the Genocide Convention. And that is to make sure that the Israeli regime suffers economically until it stops massacring women and children. The Americans and the British, of course, are there to enable the Israeli regime to carry out the genocide. It's very clear. That is the objective. They want those ports to be open so that the Israelis can get on with their economy and have no hiccups, so that they can continue to massacre. But the Americans have failed. So Ansar Allah at the moment, it is when it targets the Americans, when it targets commercial ships, except for on a couple of occasions, the intention was not to sink any of the ships, but to damage them in a way to make sure that they change course, or when it comes to naval ships, to make sure that the Americans they know their place and they recognize their vulnerability. Remember, this has been going on for almost 7 months in the Red Sea, 6 to 7 months. The Americans have failed. Ansar Allah is still hitting ships as we speak. we know today there are more ships that have been struck.
Mhm.
So the Americans have failed completely in opening the Red Sea for the Israelis, but also they've punished their own ships by engaging in warfare against the people of Yemen, causing Yemen to block American and British ships too. So this is just as big as, if not even bigger in certain ways, than what's going on in Gaza. This is the defeat of the global superpower at the hands of a country that has experienced a decade of genocide. Remember, during the Saudi and Emirati-led genocidal war against Yemen, the Americans and other Western countries were not only providing advisors and weapons and the capability to carry out the genocide, but the Americans in particular, along with other Western regimes, they were imposing a starvation siege in the very same Red Sea that today Ansar Allah commands authority. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a colossal defeat for the United States, and Americans and Europeans should be careful when they should think more carefully, their regimes at least, they should think more carefully when they're dealing with countries like Russia or Iran, because if they cannot defeat Yemen, then when it comes to Iran and Russia, it's a totally different situation.
Well, speaking of escalations, in the past week, there's been
And sorry, because you mentioned the word escalation, Ansar Allah does not sink ships, again, no. Except for a couple of exceptions, because they're not seeking escalation. Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, all of the resistance axis are there to support the people of Palestine and including the Iraqis and the Syrians and the resistance there as well, to support Gaza, to support Hamas and its allies. But they're also showing the international community, the global South, that we want stability. If Indian ships, Chinese ships, Russian ships, South African ships, Brazilian ships, all the Ansar Allah, the Yemenis, Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq, none of them want to destroy the lives of people across the global South. What they are doing is escalating in a way in which puts pressure on the Israeli regime without putting pressure on people across the world, and to force the Israeli regime to end its genocide. And to force the West, which is supporting the genocide, the Germans, the French, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, the British, who are all supporting the Holocaust, to force them to change policy. And the escalation there's only escalation when there is a need for escalation, when there needs to be more pressure, for example, on the Israeli regime. Otherwise, the players, the actors, the axis of resistance, they are responsible actors, and they do not want to cause damage to people living across the global South.
Well, in the past week, though, there has been a big increase in tensions on the northern occupied territories of Hezbollah. They carried out a significant assault, which led to then widespread fires that got quickly out of control. In response, Israel
in northern Palestine, yes.
Yes. And in response, Israel carried out some drone strikes. Actually, this morning, I believe they killed 2 Hezbollah operatives, so they say. Today, Hezbollah claims to have targeted Israel's Iron Dome defense system with a guided missile. That's in the northern Palestine as well. And then Israel media later reported another fire, and it's kind of going back and forth, but it seems a little bit more violent, or a little warmer. And then there was another attack on the IDF's position. The recent escalation has led to increased hostilities. But we're wondering what it was Hezbollah's initial attack in response to. Will this continue on? And what are your thoughts for more aerial bombardments of southern Lebanon?
again, any escalation on behalf of the resistance, whether it's Iran when it struck the Israeli regime, and it will again punish the Israelis in future, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq and Syria or Lebanon or Yemen, any escalation, or even in the case of Gaza and the West Bank, they are calculated and carefully carried out. So an increase in the tensions alongside the Palestinian-Lebanese border or in the Red Sea are calculated. They're well calculated to put pressure on the regime to accept a ceasefire that's acceptable to Hamas. Hamas must be convinced that they get a good deal from this genocidal, monstrous regime. That's nothing less than that is acceptable. So the pressure will increase against this regime until it is forced to accept the conditions dictated by Hamas at the negotiating table. The minimal requirements, where in future the Israeli regime will have. Remember, the Israeli regime, like its Western allies, they are completely unreliable. Whether it's the nuclear deal, whether it's the Minsk Accords, whether it's previous ceasefires between the Israeli regime and the Palestinians, they are completely unreliable. And when they violate deals, there's no accountability. No one in the West is going to punish the Israeli regime for violating a truce, violating a ceasefire, or violating an agreement. That will never happen. So there has to be a negotiated deal where the Israeli regime cannot violate a deal without paying a price. This is the same model that sort of that I was discussing earlier when it comes to the nuclear program or anything else. With the West, you cannot trust them. They're deceitful and they're unfaithful. So any deal has to have mechanisms built within it to make sure they cannot violate the deal without paying a heavy price. So Hamas needs a peace deal, a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, to be more precise, where the Israeli regime's hands are tied, where it cannot cheat the Palestinian people and just begin massacring women and children again. Because again, as I said, Western media will justify it, Western regimes will support it. They will, even those who grumble in public and private, they're sending weapons, they're giving them funding, they're enabling them to carry out this genocide. The West has exposed itself as completely uncivilized. They are the collective West, or these Western regimes, are a menace to humanity, and they are the greatest threat to human existence. And I think increasingly, fortunately, people in the West, especially young people, are seeing this for themselves. In the past, they destroyed the rest of the world. Now they're destroying their own countries. That's how selfish and corrupt these people are. These people in power. So the resistance will impose heavier costs on the Israeli regime until we reach a stage where Hamas gets a deal which it can feel confident about.
Well, I was going to ask about the possibility of a ground attack in the north, but I think you've kind of covered what that would look like for the IOF. But the Northern Command Chief, Ori Gordon, did say last week we completed preparations for an attack in the north. He's talking about ground forces. So, I mean, is this even in the realm of possibility? And what other preparations could they have done that they haven't done over the last 8 months? We've seen the Israeli army's abysmal performance in Gaza. The fact that they have to keep on killing women and children is indicative that their army is not great and not performing that well.
Well, that is the intention of the army. That's actually indicative of the nature of the regime and the army. They are allowing their soldiers to carry out genocide. Their pilots are carrying out genocide based on the wishes of the commanders of the Air Force, and so the Israeli regime is a it is like the Nazi regime in Germany. It's like ISIS. It's like the Contra rebels. These are evil people who will do anything if they can get away with it. But Lebanon is not Gaza. And if Israel attacks Lebanon, they will be in a much more difficult position than they are today. If attack Hezbollah's, as I said, its capabilities are underground, and they are across Lebanon, and their capabilities are far greater than Hamas, because Hamas is surrounded. Gaza is a small piece of land surrounded by the enemy. Hezbollah has all the weapons and capabilities that it needs. All its tunnels are extensive. They go across a much wider territory. They have much greater capability and facilities to make those tunnels. That would be the greatest trap that the Israeli regime ever fell into. It would bring down the regime. It would fast forward the end of the regime. I'm not saying it would collapse during such a war, but it would. The regime is heading towards collapse. The apartheid regime, the project has failed. The world despises it. Even Westerners are increasingly hating it, and only the most evil and brutal or brainwashed people in the West still support this Nazi Israeli regime. But if they go into Lebanon, they will. That is exactly what Hezbollah has been preparing for them for the last few decades, especially the last 2 decades. It would be a massacre. It would be the destruction of the regime, their armed forces. I don't think they're that stupid, and I think they know. After they failed, remember, it's been, what, 9 months now? How many months has it been in almost Gaza? Between 8 and 9 months,
8,
right?
9, yeah. Between 8 and 9.
Between 8 and 9 months now, since the land campaign in Gaza began. Gaza is a dot on the map. And the Israeli regime, after 8, 9 months, has completely failed. They have no chance against Hezbollah. And in supporting Hezbollah, it's much easier for Iran to support Hezbollah than it is for Iran to support Hamas because of geography. So imagine what sort of capabilities Hamas has with Iranian support over the last few decades that has made the Israeli regime fail to capture this dot on the map. And then imagine what Hezbollah has, and with the easy access that it has to the outside world, to Syria, to Iran, to the Mediterranean, and the capabilities that it has accumulated over the decades, it's just something. It's at a completely different level. So the Israeli regime will definitely be defeated in any attack on Lebanon.
Well, speaking of the maniacal Israeli or Zionist regime, today is the USS Liberty Remembrance Day. So I figured we would end the interview with maybe what your thoughts are about the USS Liberty. And again, a lot of our listeners don't even know what happened on the USS Liberty. It's pretty funny because I have a friend that every so often will post on Twitter that the Yemenis sunk the USS Liberty and put up a picture, and everybody gets excited because nobody knows the actual USS Liberty story. So it's just kind of a joke. But yeah, so I kind of wanted to touch on the USS Liberty and how that is just kind of swept under the rug.
Yes, well, I think it's very symbolic. The Israelis, of course, attacked the USS Liberty and killed and wounded a large number of Americans. But it's sort of reflective of the reality that we live in today. Just the Israeli regime back then sacrificed Americans and got away with it. It was never punished by the United States. And today, the Israeli regime is destroying the collective West. It has demolished the West. The West has no credibility across the world. The West is seen as the greatest violator of human rights in a way that we've never seen before. I mean, we all know that the West has been killing millions of people in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya in its dirty war in Syria, and supporting the Israelis in their invasion of Lebanon and Gaza, the genocidal war in Yemen. Um, we all know how destructive the collective West is for the world. But the genocide that's been taking place for the last 8-9 months now has been carried out live in front of a global audience. And the West has been supporting it. Remember, for months, the West was saying no ceasefire. The Europeans and the Americans, as the massacres were taking place, they were saying no ceasefires. The Israelis must continue. Only after public opinion in the West began turning on them, they began to pretend that their positions had changed, which is, a lie. They're the same genocidal leaders that they were before. And the Western media is just as supportive of genocide as it was before. They have no humanity or anything like that. But ordinary people, they're outraged. We see that even in Germany now. So, where public opinion has turned against the regime. So Israel has sacrificed the West. By continuing this war, the West has lost its image. Its image has been destroyed across the global South. So when people look to Russia and the United States, when people look to Iran and the United States, when the people look to China and Europe, they don't support the West. They despise what the West has done. And the Israelis don't care. They will sacrifice the West for their own selfish interests, just like they did with the USS Liberty. They can sacrifice the West and get away with it, like they did in the past and like they are doing so today. But the difference today is that the Israeli regime can get away with it in the West, but they can't get away with it in the world. And they can't get away with it in the region. The collective resistance is destroying the image, the military and intelligence capabilities of the Israeli regime, the image that it had created before about being some sort of superpower in the region has all fallen away. As I said, they haven't been able to take a dot on the map. And then, of course, across the world, the Israeli regime is despised as an ethno-supremacist apartheid regime, a racist regime that carries out genocide. The world sees that now. So the regime can't get away with it, but it has been sacrificing the West. The Israeli regime is a liability. The Israeli regime is a liability for every single Western regime. And I think that's clear for everyone. It's not a strategic asset. It's simply a liability that's getting bigger and bigger as time moves on. But the Israeli regime doesn't care. They don't care about the Americans. They don't care about the Europeans. So European and American leaders can grovel day and night, which they do. Members of Congress, the Senate, European parliamentarians, they grovel to the feet of those to AIPAC and to other institutions that are controlled by Zionists, whether Christian Zionists or Jewish Zionists or secular Zionists. They may grovel all they want, but the Israelis, they're not grateful. They're not grateful for all these sacrifices that the West is making, the collective West is making in supporting this Holocaust. They're not grateful. They're very ungrateful Nazis. And this is something that I think it's sort of like what you saw when we read about what they did in the past to the American naval ship is similar to that, but at a much greater scale, a much larger scale.
That was the fantastic way to kind of juxtapose that and now and Israel as the ungrateful Nazis. I really don't think that there's a better way to describe them. But thank you so much, Professor. What are you looking forward to in the next couple of months, and what have you got going on?
Nothing in particular. thoughts and prayers are with the people of Gaza and the people of the region. And hopefully the resistance, the collective resistance, will continue to batter the regime. And hopefully the broader resistance in civil society across the world, especially in the West, they will put more pressure on these Western regimes that support the Israelis. And I think we should all be very grateful to young Americans and Europeans who see through the propaganda, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, everyone, all of these people who are taking great risks to stand up to these people. And I'm looking forward to a region where ethno-supremacism and apartheid ceases to exist, and where Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live in peace.
Well,
That's, of course, not for the next couple of months, but hopefully in the next couple of months we'll see more defeat for the empire and the Israeli regime.
I think that we will, and maybe we will see you at BRICS. Thank you so much, Professor. It has been another episode of the DDGeopolitics podcast, and I thank you all for joining us. Until next time.